The courtroom fell into stunned silence as Pam Bondi raised a single file folder, her hands steady, her voice unwavering. Judge Frank Caprio, known for his warmth and humor, had chuckled earlier when she walked in, dismissing her as the Sunshine State's sweetheart playing lawyer. But now, the mood had shifted. She opened the folder, revealing evidence so meticulously compiled, so devastating in precision, that gasps echoed through the chamber. Caprio leaned forward, his laughter gone, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. Across the aisle, two corporate lawyers exchanged panicked glances. As Bondi spoke, every word became a chisel, striking at the facade of justice corrupted by influence. No one had expected this, especially not Judge Caprio. Stay tuned to see how one woman's brilliance dismantled an empire, right in open court. Comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the most unbelievable moments from the courtroom. The doors creaked open at precisely 9:01 a.m., their hinges groaning in protest as if reluctant to let in what the morning had in store. All eyes in the modest courtroom turned toward the entrance. What they saw wasn't what they expected. She stepped through the doorway with deliberate composure, the heels of her steel-gray pumps clicking softly on the worn tile floor. A fitted white blazer, crisp and tailored, wrapped around her frame like armor. Her blonde hair was pinned back in a soft twist, every strand meticulously in place. Her expression, however, was unreadable, a perfect balance of calm confidence and restrained tension. Pam Bondi. The murmur that rippled through the courtroom was immediate and hushed, a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Some recognized her instantly. Former Attorney General of Florida, a fixture of the nightly news for nearly a decade, and more recently, a sharp-tongued legal analyst who had taken to cable television with a flair for dissecting criminal cases like a surgeon with a scalpel. But today, there was no camera crew, no studio lights, and certainly no anchor desk. Today, Pam was on the other side of the bench, the defendant's side. She nodded politely to the bailiff as she approached the defense table, her heels barely making a sound now, as if even the floor itself was reluctant to challenge her presence. With graceful precision, she removed her blazer, folded it over the back of the chair, and revealed a simple navy blouse underneath. From her leather briefcase, she withdrew a set of neatly organized files, stacked with care, tabs marked in blue and red. Her movements were calm, mechanical, as though this were just another day in court, except this time she wasn't arguing the law. She was the law, now questioned. Somewhere near the back row, a spectator leaned toward her friend and whispered, just loud enough to be heard, "She looks like she's about to teach everyone here a lesson." Even Judge Frank Caprio, grizzled and seasoned from decades of cases that blurred the line between comedy, tragedy, and morality, couldn't help but smile. "Well, well, Ms. Bondi," he said, his voice carrying its usual blend of warmth and curiosity. "Did you miss the courtroom this much, or are you just here to stir up some drama?" The corners of Pam's mouth turned up slightly. "Neither, Your Honor. Just here to clear my name," she said, her voice steady but firm. "And, perhaps, shed a little light." The room tensed. Her words landed with a soft but unmistakable weight. Was this the same woman who once held press conferences with the governor? Who stood behind podiums promising justice for victims, wielding the law like a sword and shield? Something was off. And yet, something was about to be revealed. The crowd didn't quite know what to make of her yet, but it was clear that today wasn't going to be a typical hearing. Pam Bondi hadn't walked into that courtroom to defend herself. She had walked in to expose something far bigger. Judge Caprio shuffled through the thick file before him, the crisp rustling of paper breaking the quiet tension that had settled over the courtroom. He peered over his reading glasses, then looked directly at Pam Bondi, who sat poised and composed at the defense table. "Pam Bondi," he began in his steady, measured voice, "you're being summoned today on serious allegations. Failure to disclose lobbying revenue tied to federal contracts funneled through your consulting firm. This is not a minor oversight. It's a potential violation of federal law. How do you plead?" Without a flicker of hesitation, Pam's voice rang out clear and confident. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Caprio arched an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism teasing his expression. "Not just denying the charges, but doing so with a smile. That's unusual in my courtroom. Care to explain?" Pam leaned forward just slightly, her gaze steady, unwavering. "My firm never took a cent from the contracts in question," she said firmly. "In fact, I believe we were targeted precisely because we refused to play along with certain backdoor deals." The judge nodded slowly and motioned to the prosecutor, a sharply dressed young man named Daniel Coyle, who had been waiting patiently at his table. Coyle rose, adjusting his tie before addressing the court. "Your Honor, the government's case is supported by financial records showing direct transfers from Atlantic Systems, LLC, to Ms. Bondi's consulting firm totaling $225,000 over the past 18 months. For context, Atlantic Systems was awarded 3 federal contracts during this period, contracts on which Ms. Bondi provided advisory services." The courtroom was silent except for the prosecutor's clear voice. Pam's face remained calm, her eyes focused but unflinching. "Atlantic Systems, yes," she replied, "but those funds weren't for lobbying or federal contract work. They originated from a separate media consulting arrangement predating those contracts, an arrangement that's fully documented and unrelated." Coyle frowned slightly, stepping forward. "And you expect the court to believe that there was no overlap between your consulting income and the lobbying revenue? That these transactions were completely separate?" "I don't expect the court to believe anything without evidence," Pam said with quiet authority. "Which is why I came prepared." She reached into her briefcase and retrieved a USB drive, placing it carefully in the bailiff's hand. A low murmur swept through the courtroom as the bailiff approached Judge Caprio's bench and handed over the evidence. The courtroom monitor flickered to life, displaying a detailed, color-coded financial breakdown. Emails time-stamped over the last 2 years appeared side by side with bank statements and correspondence with Atlantic Systems executives. There were spreadsheets outlining the income streams, and even her personal tax filings, painstakingly organized to show a clear separation between her media consulting and federal contract advisement work. Caprio leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen thoughtfully against the armrest. "You've been busy preparing this." Pam smiled faintly. "Justice is a habit, Your Honor," she said, "and it's one I never dropped." The judge regarded her for a moment longer, then addressed the prosecutor. "Mr. Coyle, it seems we'll need to take a closer look at this material. The burden is on the prosecution to prove the connection they claim." As the evidence played out on the screen, the courtroom shifted in energy. The simple narrative the prosecution had hoped for was unraveling. Pam Bondi was no longer merely a defendant. She was steering the court toward uncovering the tangled truth behind the accusations, one carefully documented file at a time. The courtroom had been locked in a tense hush as the evidence played out, the sterile facts and numbers floating between the judge, the prosecution, and Pam Bondi. But beneath the layers of financial spreadsheets and legal jargon lay a far deeper, more personal story, one the court had yet to hear. Pam took a slow, steadying breath. Her gaze shifted from the judge to the gallery, where reporters, spectators, and a few familiar faces leaned in, sensing something important was about to be revealed. The cold formality of the courtroom softened in that moment. "I'm not just here to defend my reputation," she began quietly, her voice trembling just slightly. "I'm here because this case, this whole ordeal, means something far more personal to me." A ripple of curiosity and confusion stirred the audience. "My brother," she continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He worked for the Department of Justice. For years he tracked unethical federal contracts, corruption, and wrongdoing that many wanted buried. He was relentless. Dedicated." She paused, swallowing hard. 2 years ago he died. Officially, it was ruled suicide. The word hung in the air like a heavy fog. The gallery was still, the only sound the faint shuffle of papers and a whispered intake of breath from a reporter in the back. "But I found his files after his death," Pam said, voice cracking with the weight of memory. "Documents he left behind, detailed reports, emails, and notes about companies like Atlantic Systems. He was on to something big, something dangerous." Caprio's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. He leaned forward, the seriousness of the moment settling on his weathered features. "Are you saying," he asked carefully, "that this case against you was planted? That someone fabricated these charges to discredit you because of what your brother uncovered?" Pam nodded slowly, the strength in her eyes returning. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe someone needed to silence my brother, and now they're trying to silence me before I can finish what he started." A silence deeper than before enveloped the courtroom. Even the prosecution looked momentarily unsettled, his confident demeanor faltering. Pam's voice softened but carried fierce resolve. "I've spent every day since his death following his trail, digging into what he couldn't finish. I'm here not just to prove my innocence, but to expose the truth. For him. For justice." Judge Caprio sat back in his chair, the weight of her revelation settling heavily upon him. This was no ordinary case of financial misconduct. It was personal. It was painful. And it was far more complicated than anyone in the courtroom had imagined. The courtroom had shifted from a place of accusation to a stage for truth, a truth that Pam Bondi was determined to bring to light, no matter the cost. Judge Caprio allowed the courtroom to settle into a profound silence. The usual murmurs, the shuffling of papers, even the subtle rustle of clothing faded away, replaced by the weight of what had just been revealed. For a long moment, he simply sat, eyes fixed on the polished wood of his bench. Slowly, he removed his glasses and brought his hands up to rub his temples, as if trying to ease the heavy gravity pressing on his mind. The courtroom watched him, some curious, some anxious, but all respectful of the man whose decades on the bench had earned him a reputation for fairness, empathy, and wisdom. "This court," Caprio finally spoke, his voice low and steady, "sees its fair share of misunderstandings, sometimes even tragedies, but rarely do we stand on the edge of something that could be a reckoning." His gaze shifted to Pam Bondi, who sat upright, her expression unreadable but alert. "You came prepared today, Ms. Bondi," he said thoughtfully, "not just to defend yourself against serious allegations, but to challenge the very system itself. That takes courage, a kind of bravery that most people don't have." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. "But that courage," he continued, "places a heavy burden on this court. Because if what you're saying is true, if this case isn't simply about lobbying revenue or consulting fees anymore, then it's about something much deeper, something darker. It's about conspiracy and truth." Caprio turned his eyes toward the gallery for a moment, surveying the faces of those watching, the reporters scribbling notes, the spectators holding their breath, the attorneys locked in silent thought. Then, his gaze returned to Pam. "I've known a lot of good lawyers over the years, some who bent rules, some who bent the truth, and I've even known a few heroes." He let his words sink in before concluding, "I hope, for all our sakes, you're both." The courtroom was heavy with anticipation. It was clear this case would be more than just a trial. It was now a crossroads between justice and corruption, truth and deception. Judge Caprio's reflection wasn't just about the law. It was about the fragile balance between courage and consequence, and the price of standing up to powerful forces. The moment hung, silent and charged, as everyone waited to see what would come next. The judge called for a brief recess. Murmurs buzzed quietly around the courtroom as people stood stretching, whispering speculation. The hour passed like a heavy weight dragging everyone down, anticipation thick in the air. When court reconvened, the tension was palpable. Pam rose from her seat with a look of cautious determination. She turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, we have a surprise witness." The room fell into a hush. A man stepped forward, a disheveled figure in his early 40s, his clothes rumpled and his eyes darting nervously. The bailiff nodded and swore him in. Pam introduced him with a quiet urgency. "This is David Klein, former compliance officer at Atlantic Systems." David's hands trembled slightly as he took the oath, voice barely above a whisper at first. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." The courtroom leaned in. Judge Caprio's eyes sharpened. "Mr. Klein, you understand the seriousness of this? This court relies on your honesty." David nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, Your Honor. I was there when the fake invoices were created, when lobbying fees were hidden inside marketing expenses to avoid detection." He paused, looking around nervously, then leaned closer to the microphone. "I tried to report it. I warned the higher-ups. But they threatened me, my family. That's why I left, why I stayed quiet for so long." A heavy silence fell. The weight of his words settled over the courtroom like a storm cloud. Judge Caprio's voice was firm, but gentle. "You're here now, Mr. Klein. What evidence do you have to support your testimony?" David reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to Pam. "I took these copies the day before I was fired." Pam carefully opened it and took out several documents, photocopies of invoices with suspicious markings and handwritten notes. She passed them to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge and counsel. The documents were damning: altered dates, forged signatures, and a paper trail showing money funneling through a shell company registered in the Bahamas. The invoices matched the scheme Pam had outlined earlier perfectly. Whispers spread among the spectators. The defense attorney's face tightened, and even the judge's usual calm demeanor darkened with concern. Judge Caprio held up the papers, eyes scanning each page. "These documents, if authentic, they prove deliberate fraud and financial misconduct." He looked at David. "Mr. Klein, can you confirm these copies are exact reproductions of the original documents?" "Yes, Your Honor. I kept the originals hidden before I was let go." Pam nodded, her voice steady. "We can subpoena the originals and corroborate further." The courtroom's energy shifted completely. What had been a he said she said dispute suddenly became an undeniable exposé. Judge Caprio's tone deepened. "This changes everything. The integrity of Atlantic Systems is in serious question. This court will thoroughly investigate these allegations." David exhaled, relief washing over his face for the first time. Pam met Judge Caprio's gaze, a mix of hope and determination. The turning point was clear. The tide had turned, and justice was within reach. The courtroom grew silent as Judge Frank Caprio rose from his chair. His steps were deliberate but calm as he approached the edge of his bench, resting his hands lightly on the polished wood. His gaze swept slowly across the faces gathered in the courtroom, counsel, witnesses, and spectators alike, before settling on Pam Bondi. "Pam Bondi," he began, voice steady but warm. "You walked in here today with a smile on your face, and I'll admit, it made me laugh." The courtroom stirred softly. "Not out of mockery," he continued, "but maybe out of disbelief. Because I know your story, I know the weight you carry, and yet, here you are, standing tall in the hot seat." He paused, his eyes dropping to the floor momentarily, as if gathering the right words. Then he looked back up, directly at Pam. "But I've been doing this job long enough to recognize the difference between someone who's bluffing and someone who's telling the truth. And I also know when someone is fighting for more than just themselves, when they're fighting for justice that reaches beyond the courtroom walls." The atmosphere shifted, charged with the gravity of his words. He turned his gaze toward the prosecutor's table, addressing the room with the authority his position commanded. "Given the testimony of Mr. Klein and the compelling evidence presented today, this court finds the charges against Pam Bondi to be without merit." His voice was clear, unwavering. "This case is dismissed, effective immediately." A collective exhale rippled through the room. Some exchanged surprised glances, others nodded in approval. "And," Judge Caprio added, "I strongly urge the Department of Justice to open a thorough inquiry into the contracts awarded by Atlantic Systems. There is clearly more to uncover here, and it deserves the full weight of the law." He then returned his full attention to Pam. "You honored your brother's memory today. You showed this court what real justice looks like, not just in words, but in courage and truth." Pam blinked, swallowing hard. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. A single tear traced a slow path down her cheek, catching the light as it fell. The courtroom was still. The moment felt sacred. Judge Caprio softened his tone, leaning slightly forward. "Pam, sometimes the system fails us. Sometimes it lets the powerful walk away and the innocent bear the burden. But today, you reminded us all why we fight: to ensure fairness, to give voice to the unheard, and to right the wrongs that often go unseen." He nodded gently, a silent gesture of respect. Pam wiped her tear away and gave a small, resolute nod. She rose from her seat, her shoulders steadied by the judge's words. Around the room, murmurs of support grew louder. Some people clapped quietly, others whispered prayers of gratitude. Judge Caprio returned to his bench and sat down, his expression serene but thoughtful. "Court is adjourned," he declared. As the gavel fell, the room erupted softly in relieved conversations and quiet celebrations. Outside the courtroom, Pam felt a weight lift from her chest, a burden she had carried for too long. Justice had found its way. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Television cameras, reporters with microphones, and flashing lights waited eagerly for a statement. The buzz of questions hung thick in the air, anticipation palpable. But Pam Bondi walked past it all, head held high, arms folded tightly across her chest. She wasn't there for the cameras, the applause, or the fleeting taste of public approval. She didn't clear her name for fame. She didn't seek applause or headlines. She did it because someone had to, because the truth mattered, not just for her, but for those who had no voice, those crushed under the weight of corruption and silence. She carried a quiet strength, forged by years of sacrifice and perseverance. Judge Caprio's courtroom that day was no longer just a place where laws were recited and verdicts rendered. It had become a battleground for truth, a place where the smallest voices could rise up against the loudest injustices, where courage could turn the tide, and where hope found a home even in the darkest moments. Truth, when wielded with bravery, always finds its way. It cuts through deception like light through fog, illuminating the path forward even when the road seems impossible to navigate. Pam's story became a beacon for many, an enduring reminder that justice isn't a title or a badge, nor is it confined within the walls of a courtroom. Justice is a choice. It's a daily decision to stand up, to speak out, and to fight for what is right, even when it feels like the world is against you. And sometimes, that fight begins not with respect, but with ridicule. Sometimes, it takes being laughed at, dismissed, or underestimated before you are finally heard. But when the moment comes, when the laughter fades and the truth stands tall, it changes everything. Pam Bondi's courage showed that the real power lies not in the hands of the mighty, but in the determination of those who refuse to be silenced. That day, justice wasn't just served, it was reclaimed. And in Judge Caprio's courtroom, the message was clear. Truth and empathy can overcome even the most daunting odds, reminding us all why we fight, not for glory, but for what is right. If Pam's courage moved you, leave a comment below. What would you have done in her place? Would you risk everything for the truth? Make sure you subscribe to see more real courtroom drama and incredible moments of justice that will leave you breathless. Until next time, remember, in Judge Caprio's courtroom, every case is more than just a verdict. It's a story worth hearing.